And for our next presentation, we are joined by Promore Pharma and CEO Jonas Ekblom. Welcome, Jonas.
Thank you very much. So Promore Pharma is a small biopharmaceutical company. We have the vision to create new treatment modalities for chronic wounds and for scars. We have two human peptides under development. It's the peptide Ensereptide that is aimed for prevention of skin scarring, and it's Ropocamptide, a peptide that we're developing for treatment of venous leg ulcers, which is the most common type of non-healing leg wounds. Our drugs are therapeutic peptides. These are endogenous molecules that have multiple functions. We synthesize or produce our peptides with organic solid phase synthesis. These peptides are aimed for local administration. That means that our treatments are very safe. It's a small amount of pharmaceutical agent that we apply in the tissue where they're supposed to exert their actions. And today, on the traditional pharmaceutical markets, peptides account for approximately 12–13% of all existing prescription pharmaceuticals. I'm going to talk a few words about each of these programs, about the market potential and our current status, and I will start with the skin scarring program on Ensereptide. So today, skin scarring accounts for a marketplace that makes up approximately $25 billion in annual sales. So these are products for prevention and treatment of scars. This includes products that are sold over the counter, and it also includes certain technologies such as laser instruments. This marketplace is growing very rapidly. We're talking 9, 10, 11%, and it's forecasted that this market will continue to grow at this high rate for the next 5–6 years. What drives this market is the increased use of surgery in the world. Each year there's approximately 300 million surgical procedures done. We estimate that at least 10% of these surgical procedures result in scars that are long-term or permanent on areas of the body where you do not want to have a scar, such as the face, neck, chest, and arms. There's also an increased patient awareness and willingness to pay to avoid scars, and the overall market growth has been, over the last few years, driven by new technologies such as laser instrumentation. We deem that there are at least 30 million surgical procedures that would be applicable for treatment with Ensereptide, so this would entail an addressable market of in the order of 10 billion American dollars annually. So there's a huge market potential for our product candidate. Scars are formed by two principal biological mechanisms. It's on the one hand an increased inflammatory response in the wound, and on the other hand a reduced fibrinolytic capacity. Fibrinolysis is the body's way to remove excess material and waste byproducts that are produced during the wound healing. And these two underlying mechanisms for scar formation, they are similar irrespective of where in the body the scar occurs, whether it's on the skin or there's in a tissue, for instance, an injured tendon. The clinical manifestations, they could differ. On the skin, it could become a bulky, anesthetic scar. When it happens in the tissue, it could result in unfavorable tissue adhesions, for instance. The interesting thing with Ensereptide, our active pharmaceutical ingredient, is that it has two principal mechanisms of action. It is anti-inflammatory, so it prevents the unfavorable inflammation that occurs in scarring, and it's pro-fibrinolytic, so it increases the fibrinolysis in the tissue. Our product concept involves pre-filled syringes that are sterile, and we have a viscous carrier that consists of hyaluronic acid, HA. And this is intended as one single dosing event, so at one single time, in conjunction with the surgery, the product is applied. So this further increases the safety of this treatment modality. We are right now conducting a phase 2 clinical study, PHSU05. This is a clinical trial involving approximately 24 patients. And in our case, these are healthy volunteers. These patients, they make a total of 7 clinical visits. And on visit 2, these patients obtain each one 6 synthetic wounds. These wounds are created on the upper arms, and these wounds are randomized to be treated with either placebo or with active agent. And the neat thing about this setup is that each patient can be used as their own control, and this is valuable because there's actually quite substantial inter-individual variability between people in the propensity to build scar. Then after this visit, when the patients receive their wounds and get their single treatment, the patients are followed for 3 months. And at the 12-week visit, which is the last live visit, the patients come in and we take biopsies from these wounds. And then there's a follow-up visit, but that is done as a phone call, and that is a safety follow-up call. Started the enrollment to this study in February this year, so we're right now in the enrollment phase of the trial. I'll say a few words about the overall time plan. We intend to conclude the inclusion period of this study now in March, and if we succeed with that, we should have the last patient last visit sometime in the middle of the year, in the summer. And after that starts what will be the most work-intense period of this clinical study, namely the histopathological assessment of the biopsies we have taken. And I should say that during this entire time, all samples and all patients will be blinded, so we will not know to what extent Ensereptide is effective versus placebo. We intend to make communications to the market on 3 occasions from here on out. We intend to announce when we have completed the inclusion period, in other words, when the last patient has been enrolled into the study. We intend to communicate when we've had the last patient last visit in the study. And of course, we intend to communicate once we have data from the study, and that will be towards the very end of the year, the beginning of 2023. And again, it's the histopathological assessment that is done during the fall that will be the pacer for this study. So short about Ensereptide and the path forward the next 12 months. Of course, the most important operative involvement we have is the conclusion of the PHSU05 clinical trial that will be completed by the very end of this year, beginning of next year. And in parallel, we're also assessing what will be the optimal further development path in this program. And as you can imagine, it will be very important to have these results to understand what the next steps of development may entail. So a few words about the other program, the Ropocamptide program that is aimed for treatment of chronic wounds. Every 30 minutes, every half an hour, a person in the world loses a limb due to a landmine, which of course is a huge human tragedy. But to put chronic wounds in perspective, every 30 seconds a person loses a limb due to a chronic wound. And chronic wounds are typically defined as wounds that have not shown signs of healing or regressing within 6 weeks. Many patients have these wounds for years or even decades. For the patient, this involves pain, bad odor, reduced mobility, but it also involves a risk for severe infections that can result in amputations or even death. And the standard care for venous leg ulcers, the type of wounds we are addressing, is compression bandaging, where a patient typically comes to a primary care facility 2 or 3 times per week, or is visited in the home by a nurse that applies these bandages. The chronic wound market is estimated at approximately $20 billion in products for wound treatment and wound care. The largest segment here are the so-called moist dressings. This marketplace is growing with approximately 6% annually and will continue to do so over the next few years. What drives this market is an increase in the age population. There is an increased burden that is a consequence of that, of chronic disease, such as obesity and diabetes. And there is an increased recognition from health authorities and from reimbursing authorities and insurance companies for new products that ultimately yield more wound-free time. We estimate that there is at least 1 million patients on the traditional pharmaceutical markets that have a large venous leg ulcers. This is the type of target patient group that we are aiming at, and that in turn would translate into an addressable market of in the order of $3 billion annually. Our product, Ropocamptide, is a naturally occurring peptide, so you naturally have it in the skin, for instance. It's antimicrobial, it's angiogenic, meaning that it stimulates the formation of blood vessels in the dermis. It stimulates the migration of keratinocytes, cells that are important to close an open wound. In an acute wound, there are quite high levels of endogenous LL37 available, but in chronic wounds, this peptide is lacking, so we see this as a replacement therapy. And we add this peptide in conjunction with the regular dressing change these patients go through, so these patients don't need to be hospitalized, for instance, to be treated with our drug. We concluded a quite ambitious phase 2 clinical study about a year ago, the HEAL LL37 study. This was a phase 2b study where patients were treated in 3 groups. Patients were treated either with placebo or 2 doses of Ropocamptide. Patients were treated for 3 months, and then we had a 4-month follow-up period. And this long follow-up period you have in a protocol like this to ensure that if a wound is healed, that it does not reoccur shortly after end of treatment. The most significant or important finding that we had in this study was that patients with large wounds, and this is typically defined as patients that have a wound of a size of 10 square centimeters or larger, had a very notable response to our study drug. So we saw that we had a 3-fold increase in the number of completely healed wounds on the optimal dose of Ropocamptide versus placebo. So ROP-LD stands for Ropocamptide low dose, and ROP-HD stands for Ropocamptide high dose. And we saw generally a very strong, good response with the lowest dose of Ropocamptide, and this corresponds actually to a finding that we saw in a prior clinical study. We had, for instance, a very notable effect on the frequency of patients that had a 70% closure of their wounds, and we saw a nearly 5-fold increase in wound healing rate in those patients that received the low dose of Ropocamptide. So that would be the dose, that would be the recommended dose for a future phase 3 study. Also, the safety was very good in this study. We had no significant difference between the various treatment arms in this study. We can see here, for instance, that at the end of the study, actually, the placebo group had a slightly higher number of local reactions than the 2 study drug arms. And also here in the graph at the right, we see that the very vast majority of adverse events that were reported were considered to not be related to the study drug. So in summary, we had a very, very strong safety and tolerability. In this program, we are working right now to improve our product formulation. In the clinical trial that we concluded, we had a product that consisted of 2 syringes which needed to be combined, blended before each application. This is feasible or doable in a clinical trial setting, but in the commercial setting, we know that we need to have a product that is simpler for the patient or the physician to use. So right now we're creating a single component product, and we aim to have preliminary data from this development in the second half of this year. In parallel, we're also taking steps for future development, so we're manufacturing some of the key materials for future clinical trials, and we're doing right now an assessment on how a phase 3 clinical study setup could be, including ways for us to finance such a study. So, in short, we are a company that are addressing 2 significant medical needs where there today are no prescription pharmaceuticals. We are addressing large markets that actually have a very high growth rate, 2 to 3 times higher than what you see in the average pharma sector. We are working with a technology that is validated. We have done several clinical studies, and we have several patent families that protect this technology in both of our programs. We have an extremely high safety profile because these are locally administered drugs. And we actually have a very strong opportunity to grow the number of clinical applications for these drugs in the future. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you will continue to follow Promore Pharma and perhaps include us in your investment portfolio. Thank you very much.
And thank you for the presentation. Just have a couple of follow-up questions. You mentioned here that there are no pharmaceutical products in your indications. Why is that?
Well, that is a very good question, and I think I don't have a perfect answer to it, but I have some ideas. One is it's actually quite a complex area of biology. It's an intersection of endocrinology, dermatology, cell biology. So it's difficult to create solutions. There is no physician's specialty in this area. These are generally dermatologists, but you don't have a medical specialty in wound care. And thirdly, these are patients that traditionally have not had a very strong voice. There are no strong patient organizations, for instance, driving awareness. But perhaps more important than anything is that you don't have any effective products. I think this will all change the moment an effective drug hits the market that can be used to treat these conditions.
And if we look at the wider indications, how do you view your candidate's potential beyond these two primary indications that you spoke about?
I think they're very strong. So if we take the skin scarring project, that product could in principle be used to treat any type of scarring. We have, for instance, previously looked at the type of scarring that occurs when you injure, let's say, a tendon in a finger, because there you have scarring that causes restrictions in mobility. We're absolutely sure that it can be used for that. It could be used in spinal surgery or other type of surgical procedures. And with regards to Ropocamptide, we're working with venous leg ulcers because that's the largest type of chronic wounds in the Western Hemisphere, but you have other common types of chronic wounds such as diabetic foot ulcers and pressure ulcers.
Well, and with that, we say thank you, Jonas, for coming and telling us more about your company.
Thank you very much.